Hey guys, Sean here from SRC Tech. Today I'm going to be covering the teardown of a Dell G7 laptop. If you have any G-Series laptop from 2019, you can use this guide. I've had a few of them apart. They're all pretty much the same, and we're going to cover the process that I use to replace thermal paste and liquid metal if you're brave enough. And then we're going to cover RAM upgrades and storage upgrades as well. So the first thing we'll do is gather our tooling. We want to have a small electronics screwdriver kit. I use the iFixit Protect toolkit personally. It has everything you're going to need, but if you don't, a small screwdriver and a small plastic wedge tool will work. And then I use 91% isopropyl alcohol and Scott's Blue shop towels. We'll use those to remove thermal paste later. So what we're going to do now is go ahead and take all 10 screws off of the back cover, and that will leave the internals exposed. The two in the middle on the bottom are captive, so they're not going to come all the way out, but the other 8 should come all the way out. So what we're going to do next is take our plastic pry tool and get up underneath one of the corners. I suggest on the front of the laptop. Those are going to be the easiest to start with. Once you have one corner popped loose, you should be able to gently just pull up and release all of the other little tabs. They're not on very snug, and if you leave the screws out, the bottom cover is not going to want to stay on after a while anyways, so it's not going to scare you as you try to pull it out. I'll go ahead and briefly cover, after I've got this open, the upgrade options you have. You'll have an NVMe SSD slot and a hard drive slot right underneath it with a SATA power and data cable pre-wired if you have the 60 watt-hour battery. And then there's going to be this little sticker over the RAM. I always take that off and leave it off. I left it on to show you guys. What you're going to want to do is pull these little arms out, these little tabs. The RAM will sort of pop up a bit. Then you can just pull that out, realign the notch, push in, and then once you've got it in, it'll be at that wedge that it was at when you popped it out. Just push down, not very hard. The little metal arms are automatically going to grab the RAM and keep it in. Once you've heard the click, the RAM's installed, you're done. So once you've removed 2 screws for the heatsink and pulled the heatsink off, when you remove this final screw, it'll pop up. You can go ahead and just pull that out, touch it by the sides, don't touch any of the important bits. There's this little mounting bracket that, depending on which drive you got, will have to be pulled out and moved around depending on where your SSD was mounted and what size. Mine came with a little tiny one that looked like a Wi-Fi card. But the longer ones, you'll have to move this little screw down bracket up or you won't be able to properly mount the drive. So then you'll just align the notch. It'll want to sort of pop up at an angle. You'll just put your screwdriver in if you've got a magnetic screwdriver. Push down on the NVMe drive very gently. Put the screw back in. Put the heatsink back on. And you're good to go. Once you've upgraded all the hardware and you're satisfied with all of that, we can go ahead and talk about upgrading the thermal compound. I used Thermal Grizzly's Conductonaut liquid metal on the CPU as it was the hottest and was throttling the hardest. And then I used Arctic MX4 thermal paste for the GPU. And then I used a minus pad 8 to replace the thermal pads for the VRMs and the VRAM modules around the GPU. To remove it with it on, and getting the heatsink back on is impossible with the fans in, so we'll just go ahead and take those out and make everything easier. They each have one little connector. Pry on it with your pry tool of choice, remove 3 screws, and it comes out without a single fuss, and you do that for both sides until you have both fans out. Once you have both fans out, we can go ahead and take the shared heatsink assembly off. There are 7 screws, and they are labeled 1 through 7. That is the order we're going to be loosening and tightening once we reapply. Once you've loosened all 7 screws and they are captive, they will not come all the way out, we can then pull the heatsink off. Once you have all of the screws out, we can go ahead and remove and pull up on the heatsink and flip it over, and that'll give you a good look at the thermal compound on the heatsink and the GPU and CPU die. I've already done this procedure once. I put Thermal Grizzly Conductonaut liquid metal on the CPU. The CPU socket is going to be right above the RAM slots, and then I used the little black applicator that it came with. And then the GPU, I used Arctic MX4 thermal compound. And what we're going to do to get the stock paste off is dab your paper towel with your isopropyl alcohol and just wipe until both dies are shiny, and then do the same for the copper heatsink on the very top. So we're just going to go ahead and clean up the dies and remove as much of the old paste as possible. Once both CPU and GPU dies are clean, we can move on to the heatsink and repeat the same process. Get your lint-free cloth, which I use the paper towel, and some isopropyl alcohol, and just wipe all of the thermal paste off of the heatsink. Careful not to remove the thermal pads if you're keeping those. Once you have both of these cleaned, you'll notice that my GPU die side is not clean. I used liquid metal previously. It will permanently stain the copper heatsinks, so keep in mind it performs the same, it's just not going to look as pretty, but it is smooth to the touch and functionally the same. So now we're going to cover liquid metal application on the CPU die and the heatsink. You don't need a lot of this at all. Compared to thermal paste, probably a fourth of the amount will take you to the same distance. You don't want this to overflow at all, you want it to just stay on the die. Once you have put a very small dot, and I'll show you on the heatsink itself how much you need, take your Q-tip applicator, if you bought the Thermo Grizzly kit, and just spread that around until it's an even liquid film. Now for the thermal paste application on the GPU, and you can use this method for the CPU as well, I just use a small thin line in a crossing pattern or an X from corner to corner. You don't want to use too little. You definitely don't want to put the whole tube on, but I would rather have a little extra and have it spill over than not enough, because once the laptop is put together, it's not going to be easy to get back to this point if you happen to not use the correct amount of thermal paste. And there is an insulating barrier, so you're not going to destroy transistors or anything on the surface of the die itself. So just use your best judgment, but you don't want to put any on the GPU side. On the heatsink itself, you'll have plenty on the die itself. So once we have all of our thermal compounds on, we're just going to drop the CPU and GPU heatsink back down into place. There are little holes in the corner that slot, and then I like to just apply pressure to both the CPU and the GPU die, and then in order, careful not to over tighten and strip your screws. Just tighten down the heatsink 1 through 7 and you should be good to go. So once your heatsink goes reinstalled, you can then reinstall the fans. I like to put the connectors in first and then screw them down, 3 screws on each side. From here you can simply put the cover back on, put all 10 screws back in, careful not to over tighten, and you will have successfully upgraded or replaced thermal compound on your CPU and GPU. Something I didn't really cover in great detail was the thermal pad replacement. You don't have to do this. The thermal pads that it came with are fine. I bought the Thermo Grizzly -pad 8 and replaced the VRM and GDDR6 module thermal pads. It didn't really seem to help too much with performance, so I wouldn't worry too much about it. If you have any questions or comments, please post them down below. I will walk you through this process if I have to. It's not very hard. The G7 out of the box wasn't a very good laptop, and I actually don't recommend anyone ever use it in its stock configuration. But after a few tweaks and mods, I was actually able to get very good performance out of mine, and in a future video I'm going to be sharing one of the mods that I did after the fact, and then I'll show you how I tuned mine to get the most out of it.